So I want to talk about something in this video that actually scares me a lot in photography right now, and a trend that I'm starting to see in a lot of outdoor photography and landscape photography. And it's the use of artificial intelligence in the editing process. And there are a lot of software companies jumping on this trend and trying to push this forward as an editing tool to make your editing process a lot faster and a lot easier too. No doubt it's faster and a lot easier when you use these tools like sky replacement, whether you are doing something like Photoshop or using another software like Luminar. But the whole process around replacing a sky can be a very slippery slope when you get into what a landscape photograph actually is. Now, let me say before I get started, I have no problem with those of you who enjoy photo manipulation and creating something like graphic design and putting a lot of photos into one and doing something that way, taking skies from different locations and placing them into a photo. Absolutely zero problem with anyone who enjoys doing things like that with their photography, if they're doing it honestly. And when I say honestly, like when you post something saying that you did X manipulation to this type of photograph and being honest and open about what you're doing with artificial intelligence within photography. Overall, what happens with artificial intelligence is you can use it to make a lot of adjustments very quickly to your editing and to your photos. I have no problem with sliders and using those with artificial intelligence, doing something like using an AI accent slider and increasing your contrast and clarity and highlights and shadows all in one step. That's fantastic and that's really cool. But when you get into the process of, say, taking a foreground from, let's take the state of Tennessee, for example, where I live, and then you take a sky from, Amsterdam, and you put it in the exact same image, that's where things get a little bit dicey. And I'm not so much worried about it in terms of photographers in particular or the skill set that goes along with the post-processing, because everybody's post-processing workflow is a little bit different and they all have different ways of doing the same thing, whether that is photo manipulation, graphic design, creative design with photography, or classic landscape photography. Now, the distrust that I'm worried about comes in when you get into the public's view on photography. Think about the public's view currently right now. If you go to, let's say, an art show and set up your gallery, I guarantee you the number one question that you're going to get over and over again about your photos and what the process is of creating your images is how much Photoshop you're adding to your images. And Photoshop is kind of just like the verb that gets thrown into the editing process. Photoshopping, or is this photoshopped, is just that phrase that gets used. It can be any type of editing software that you use to manipulate your images to get them to a point where your creative vision matches the end result. However, that distrust is continuing to grow a little bit more. People and the outside public, out of the photography realm sphere that we live in so much with other photographers, we all know we're editing each other's photos and really getting them to a point of a realistic shot of what it was like when we were there, because of the effects that a raw file can have on an overall scene. We want to get it to that point that our creative vision had when we were actually in a location. What happens when you manipulate a photograph so much that it becomes a false representation of place is what happens when the public starts to distrust what you're representing in your photography. And that limits or that diminishes the value of a good photograph. That diminishes the value of not only a cost associated or a price associated with a print that you produce and try to sell, because it is viewed as distrustworthy or untrustworthy or fake in some terms. But also, a lot of distrust comes in with posting on social media and displaying your images. Having a realistic photograph look is one thing, but when you are lying about a location, that's when something else happens altogether, and you start to lose the public's trust in the art of photography in and of itself. I think being honest about the style of photography you like to do, whether that be creative manipulation to your images and using those phrases around your photographs that you manipulate, is a great way to do it. And I applaud you for doing that. But if you're taking, say, a Milky Way and putting it behind the skyline of New York City, where all photographers know there's so much ambient light and light pollution that you would never be able to get that shot, and you're lying about the fact that you were able to do that. Or, like my example before, taking a foreground from Tennessee, but then taking a background from a completely different part of the world or a completely different country, is just not being honest unless you're honestly writing in the description what you've done to that photograph. I know there's a lot of pushback on this thought. I know there's a lot of thought and belief about photo manipulation and how much editing can go into it. And yes, there are a lot of gray areas to it as well. But I am concerned, and the reason I wanted to make this video is because I'm so concerned about the public's view and the value associated with that public's view to photography, that I think it can really do some damage if we don't protect realistic photography, if we don't protect the classic idea of landscape photography and slight photo manipulation using softwares like Photoshop versus photo manipulation and doing something like graphic design with our images. So all that to say, I just want you to be very careful whenever you are posting your images of what you display along with them and what you write that's associated with those images. I want the value of photography to remain high. I want the inspiration that we give people to remain high. I don't want distrust or lack of honesty with artificial intelligence and sky replacements to reduce that and diminish the value of photography and photographers like you overall.